Hi, welcome to MediatorPodcast.com, a podcast and video series about mediation, negotiation, and collaboration. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I'm a valuation expert and divorce financial mediator in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we're talking about relationship issues and things to consider before you call a divorce attorney with Jackie Harounian. She's a family law attorney in Long Island, New York, and talking about some issues that I think, sometimes we spend a lot of time in this thought process of what could I do? What should I do? I don't know if this is right. And it could be months, years that you're considering, ending a relationship. And, before we even get into this type of situation where you're actually calling a divorce lawyer, which really is way down the pipeline that you're ready to go, right? And we can talk more about like what you should be ready for when you call them. But the first steps that, couples should take when they're even considering or having some issues and they don't want to use that D word, like they don't want to make that call because that call is really to an attorney is really starting a whole process that you may not be able to step back from. So what are some of those steps that they should consider?
Yeah, so that's such a great question because I think in a lot of relationships, people actually throw around the D word, the divorce word, and they're certainly thinking it, especially depending on their conflict resolution styles or how serious the issues are. For example, if there are infidelity issues, the feeling of divorce or wanting to call a divorce lawyer could be immediate. And there are all kinds of trust issues that develop these days because couples are engaging with other people online or offline. And those are issues that have to be worked out in any relationship. The actual divorce, I always tell people when I meet with them, either as a mediator or as an attorney, the divorce part, the actual termination of the marriage, which the judge signs off on, is quite a distance away. And in New York, even when we start a divorce process, it's usually about a year away or more. There are so many other steps couples can take to address legal and financial issues, relationship issues, substance abuse issues, as measures that can resolve whatever challenges are going on in their relationship. Could be a step towards divorce, but not necessarily a divorce. And a lot of couples are considering legal separation, marriage counseling, other measures before the actual divorce process even starts. And I'm all about that. When I meet with individuals, I really have to focus on what's best for that person, that couple, that family. When you're starting a divorce process in a conventional manner, you are jumping right into financial issues, potentially court procedures and other things that can really destroy the relationship or really harm it in significant ways. So that's not always the best approach.
Well, and I think that, from some of our experience, couples go into this situation and maybe kind of real quickly talk to an attorney, hire somebody, and file, thinking, and maybe we should talk about some of the fallacies as well, but thinking that the court or the judge is going to come in and miraculously, like day one, solve whatever issues are going on in the marriage, whether it be some significant, domestic abuse or violence, or even like coercive control and financial control. And that is a fallacy. And I think that, talk a little bit about like that, and even that initiation isn't really going to just overnight solve the issues. Like identifying or addressing the issues might be a first step to see if they can be handled outside of the court system situation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, listen, these types of protracted issues, certainly domestic violence or a certain financial reality, it probably took months or years to get to that point. And it's naive to think that a lawyer or a judge is just going to fix it. Unless we're talking about actual domestic violence, and I don't mean to suggest you should avoid getting help. If you're in an unsafe situation, you should absolutely be talking to an attorney, a victim services agency, call the police. I mean, your number one obligation is to keep yourself safe or your children safe. But that's not always the reality. Sometimes people use the phrase domestic violence or abuse, and they're really talking about a very unpleasant environment where there's yelling, threats, financial control, and maybe things that feel very abusive or harassment. And again, you have to get advice so that you know how that impacts you and your children. There are many times where people will throw around the term emotional abuse or verbal abuse, and it's a mutual sort of situation. There's fighting going on in the house, and children are in the front row watching this go on. So this is definitely a situation where you need to get some legal advice. It's a fallacy that women especially feel like there's yelling going on. Well, my husband needs to leave the house. That's not going to happen unless we're talking about a certain threshold of safety. If there's yelling and screaming going on in the house, a lack of access to money or bank accounts or assets, this is a first step towards getting advice. Judges are not going to remove an active father from where he lives with his children that easily. In New York, we call them stay away orders of protection. It's not so easy to get a stay away order. It's more likely that you're going to get a limited order that's going to keep everyone on their best behavior while the court figures out who is really the bad actor here, who's entitled to custody. Uh, Short of that, both parties have a right to live in their home for a long time until there's going to be an actual separation or divorce or custody order. So it's very important for men and women to understand that. Both parties have rights to live in their home. Children have a right to have access to both of their parents. And it's also true at the same time, everyone has a right to feel safe. So make sure you understand where your facts of your situation fit in with that scenario. Um, in terms of options to filing for divorce or separating the family or getting stay away orders, parties need to understand that we're living in an era of no fault divorce in most jurisdictions. In New York, we're talking about really fault not being used in the context of custody. So when you hire a divorce lawyer, if you're in a situation where you're in a lot of pain, your relationship is unraveling, your life feels chaotic, you need to understand that a divorce attorney, if that's what you're going in to hire, is going to very quickly start setting the stage for an adversarial process. It's you versus your spouse. It's going to be a winner or a loser. Are you going to win custody or lose custody? And then how do you get access to the assets in your marriage? How do you get the best possible order of child support and spousal support? And by the way, who's going to pay the lawyers? This is really part of the picture from day one when you're talking about a divorce process. A lot of times, and maybe you can tell from my last name, my parents are Middle Eastern. I come from a Middle Eastern background, which is quite traditional. And I'm married over 30 years myself. I've raised 4 children. So I am a little bit on the traditional side. I often, and clients come to me because they know I'm not going to jump in and say, let's start divorce. Let's start going to a judge. And I am also a domestic violence advocate. So I'm going to tell people what they need to do to feel safe. At the same time, a lot of times when people are coming to me, there are some really important issues going on. It could be mental health issues of one of the parents or one of the children. It could be a recent autism diagnosis. It could be substance abuse. It could be a lot of conflict in the family. What do we do to address those issues and not necessarily run towards a divorce process? I'm going to be one of those divorce attorneys that recommend marriage counseling. 100%. I'm going to ask my client, have you considered that? I know you're upset. I know things are going on, but have you considered marriage counseling? Do you want to talk about individual counseling? Sometimes my client has the issue. My client is the one acting badly. They're the ones drinking, or they're the ones restricting access to bank accounts or not paying bills. This can only escalate as time moves on. So there are certain techniques I have with clients to get them to consider options to divorce, if that's what they want. So that means postnups, separation agreements, counseling, maybe financial counseling, maybe getting on the same page regarding what's happening with children with special needs. But there are conversations we can have about those things. But Melissa, there are times people come to me and they say, oh, no, I've done all that. I want to get divorced. That's what I want. That's what I'm ready for. And of course, that I'm going to help them hopefully have an uncontested divorce, hopefully an amicable divorce, which means we're not running to a court right away. Again, unless there's a need to go to court. We have a larger firm. We have 10 lawyers here. We are in court quite a bit. But I tell my clients, whenever possible, that's going to be a plan B. If you're co-parenting, you want to at least try to resolve issues like that without a judge and a law guardian and things like that involved. So if co-parenting is really what parents want, a lot of times we're talking about two working parents in New York, 50-50 custody, and joint custody is very much on the table for working parents. We need to talk about whether that really works for this family. So all of that before we start talking about money and judges and restraining orders and a fight. All of those conversations start before that. And people are surprised that sometimes they can stay out of court and work those issues out, either with a mediator or two attorneys that are focused on a collaborative process or a settlement process where everyone identifies goals and tries to reach them collaboratively.
Well, and I mean, that is just an amazing summary of kind of all of the issues that you would be considering. And how I liken, calling an attorney is kind of like you decided today to start a business, and the business is going to be your divorce. And the reality is, are you going to cash flow day one, or are you going to have access, and is everything going to be fixed and ready to go and you're successful day one? No, there's a lot that goes into it. But some of the things that we were talking about kind of when we were talking about this subject was, I think first things first, people need to educate themselves. And, divorce is very state specific. So if you're getting divorced in your state, everything has to be according to your state. So if you talk to your friends and they're in another state, it's not going to be the same information. You're in the state of New York, and obviously attorneys can work in various states. But one of the things that each state usually has is some research and some information even available to everyone. And I think educating yourself and getting prepared in any capacity for this process, because it is a legal based process that has financial aspects to it. But even just before we're starting out, like I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, yeah, this is really, I'm not wanting to do this anymore. And we can maybe agree to it, but I probably need to position it right to my spouse. So what are some of the most common mistakes that couples can make when considering divorce, talking about divorce, starting to maybe say, hey, this is going to go a different way. Could there be missteps, or is there maybe some guidance of how to make it a little bit easier?
Yeah, I mean, by the time people are speaking to me, I'm a divorce lawyer. They need to understand that they are in a legal process, whether it leads to divorce or not. They cannot underestimate their spouse, and they should assume that evidence is being gathered against them or already has been gathered. So the number one mistake people make is they create evidence that can be used against them. They're posting things on Facebook. They're already sharing details about their new girlfriend or boyfriend. They're saying things that are being captured on voicemail or text messages, or antagonizing potentially important witnesses, teachers and coaches and family members. They're forgetting that they are messing up their kids who are watching the fighting going on and hearing the word divorce or bankruptcy, or you're going to be out on the street, and not understanding that they are already causing damage to themselves, to their legal strategy, and most importantly, to their children. So children that are under the age of 10 might not be overtly reacting to hearing fighting, but children these days are very anxious. I mean, there's a lot of studies that show that anxiety levels in children are much higher than in previous generations. So a 10-year-old might not verbalize it, but there's a lot of damage that's done because they hear things, they develop anxiety, and then in later years, it comes out as anger. It comes out because children will start withdrawing from friendships, start losing motivation in school. And one of the first things parents need to do, especially before they separate, if they're living in the same house, is understand that there's very likely going to be some sort of joint custody outcome, whether they like it or not. There's going to be co-parenting that's required, even if one parent is the primary custodian, and that judges are going to pay attention to alienating behavior, out of control anger, threats, things that people do that just are not going to look that great for them 6 months or a year later. So assume you're being taped, assume that evidence is being collected, assume that your children are going to be harmed unless you and your co-parent can make a decision very early on in the case that we are not going to harm our children. We're going to make sure their activities are paid for, their camp is paid for, that we are maintaining a certain status quo, trying to make sure that this major life transition, which your children have not asked for, that we're going to make things right for them. And if parents can at least do that, they're going to have a better outcome, no matter whether it's legal separation or divorce, or if the family manages to avoid all of that. So that's the number one advice. And it's part of my initial consultation. Just make sure you're not making things worse for yourself. And the other thing is, consider legal separation as an option to divorce if you're ambivalent. And even if you're not ambivalent. So in most states, in every state, you can only stay on a medical insurance plan, health insurance plan, if you're still married. You cannot cover an ex-spouse. So this is not a state-by-state thing at all. So imagine how much you can save if you stay legally separated for a few extra months, formally or informally. Sometimes with the legal separation agreement, you can't stay on the same medical insurance, but at least explore that option. Explore the option of filing a joint tax return for another year or two. You're going to save on taxes if you file as a married couple. That can be a significant savings if you work together. Again, you need to speak to your attorneys and accountants. You don't want to file jointly if there's risk to you, if there's unreported income, but you can do indemnification agreements. You can get around that. So consider the savings of a legal separation when it comes to medical insurance, when it comes to filing a joint tax return. There's other expenses that can be shared. And it's sort of a slower route towards a divorce. A lot of couples now, because the cost of housing is so high in the New York area, certainly, but in many areas, what if you can live amicably together, share space together, and still move forward with potentially a divorce? And that means you have to be on your best behavior, because maybe you're going to be dating someone new. You have to be respectful towards your partner, towards your children. But maybe it means cohabiting for a little while longer. There are lots of possibilities. Nesting is another option where parties will agree to keep the children in the house full time for a year or two while they move in and out of the house and have a separate dating life, or maybe live with family in alternate weeks. And it can be an amazing cost saving measure, especially because one of the biggest issues now is that parties literally can't afford to separate. They can't afford to buy each other out because interest rates are so high and housing costs are so high. So you have to be a little bit creative. And so nesting can be a great way to do that. So I see more and more couples considering that as an option. And a few years ago, that would have been unthinkable. Like, what do you mean live together with my spouse and do something like that?
Well, and it's interesting because even if it's the best idea to sell the one primary residence and get another two, I think that families are also moving towards, what if you lived in a duplex, different types of options that could be. But another thing is, like, what if I'm in a relationship and I don't have kids and I don't necessarily have financial control over, of even calling. Cause like if I call the attorney, right, I don't even have money to pay a retainer. So what are some of the things that I could mess up by, not planning some steps? If I only get maybe a stipend every week and everything's paid for, so I don't even know where the bills go, what kind of situation am I in? Is my best bet to just make that call, or do I need to do a little bit more preparation?
I think preparation is very important before you meet a lawyer. And as a matter of fact, even if you're a married woman who's happily married, it's very risky to just not know what's going on with your money or your husband's money, or if you're in a same-sex marriage, your partner's money. So I would say, as a baseline, every married person should be very familiar with their tax returns. You should have. It's very easy these days to e-file and not even know what you're signing. And in many marriages, the wife is not signing anything. Everything's just kind of being done for her, and that's not a great scenario. Besides divorce, your spouse could pass away, could become disabled, could lose their job. I mean, you don't want to be that person that has never seen their tax returns, doesn't understand what all the numbers mean. So you want to look at your tax returns. You want to meet with the accountant. If your husband's meeting with the accountant, you should be meeting with the accountant. And a lot of times women, or the non-moneyed spouse, it could be a husband who stays at home and is not earning income, you feel that you're not entitled to ask questions, or you're intimidated, because it can be very intimidating. So find a financial advisor that will explain things to you, because there really are no dumb questions. Sit down with someone. It's not a lot of money to ask questions. And there are some financial advisors that will give a couple of free sessions. Have copies of your tax returns, open the credit card bills, know what's going on with your home equity, understand your mortgage statement, look at your bank accounts, and you need to keep your eyes open. In most states, you can't go back and ask the judge to look at what went on 10 years ago and say, Judge, all the home equity is gone. My husband spent it, and I don't know where it went. That's not going to fly by the time you get divorced. You're supposed to be knowing what's going on. And women, we're living in a gender neutral world. In most states, women are not given that protected status that they used to have 10 years ago. They're not being deemed the innocent spouse who is protected from the IRS the same as before. Women these days are seen as earners. In most households, men and women are both working. And in 1/3 of households, women are actually the breadwinner. So they are given the same level of responsibility and accountability as their male partners. I will say that a lot of times I see women, even the ones that are the breadwinner or who are earning the same as their spouse, they kind of take a backseat role when it comes to filing taxes, or asking questions about investments or savings or debts. And it's a little bit, I think it goes on in a lot of marriages where women are sort of like deferring to their husbands, which is fine. That's okay, but still risky. You need to know what your finances mean and not be afraid of asking money questions, whether you're single, married, or divorced. So by the time you get to the divorce, it could be too late. I mean, the money could be gone. The debts could be astronomical. And you've kind of done that to yourself. At least that's how judges think. And I always tell my clients, in the New York area, half the judges are women. And they're not going to be that charitable towards women litigants that come forward and say, Judge, I don't know what's going on. It's his fault. Let's make
Well,
everything responsibility.
and I mean, let's take it one even level further. I go to court and you go to court quite a bit, even if we're in the mediation space, even if we're trying to get cases settled. I go to court and the judge says to the person, you didn't ever ask how you got a Louis Vuitton bag every month. You never asked how you went on expensive vacations, but told the IRS you made $50,000. You never asked where the tax return was. You never thought about these things. And I think, you never went to go get a job during this process. These are actual questions that the judge is not going to give you that consideration, because they're going to say, then you need to go support yourself in some capacity. But I think the meeting, most people meet with their tax accountant or their financial planner once a year, if not multiple times a year. If they own a business, then those types of meetings you can ask to be involved. And the reality is, if you start asking questions about the financial situation and your spouse is literally like, I don't want to tell you, or I don't want to give you the information, that's your red flag. That's your time to have a conversation about, this may have been good in the past, but it's no longer good for me going forward. And we need to have conversations about this for estate planning, for if you got hit by a bus, any of those things. I would be incapacitated in this situation financially, and that's not acceptable. And I think that is, a very reasonable thing if you are in a marriage to have a conversation about, even if you are religiously or from any of your background that's a traditionally not your role. It still can be a conversation that you can have, but you may have to consider how to do it now.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. This is one of the reasons why prenuptial agreements are so great for young couples, and millennials really love them. And their divorce rate is already lower than their parents and grandparents, because young people are more egalitarian. They're accustomed to talking about money. They're splitting the bill at restaurants. Their prenuptial agreements say, if we buy a house, it's going to be owned jointly. We're coming from a generations, my parents and grandparents, where the wife's name really wasn't on the deed. And sometimes the husband's brother's name was on the deed. And women were conditioned not to ask questions. If your name is not on the deed to your house, there must be a really good reason. And if it's your brother-in-law's name on the deed, you're going to end up with no house, because the judge will deem any payments as rent. And there's a lot of families that are set up this way, where women are really behind the eight ball when it comes to their money. So yes, I really believe these red flags, they're there for a reason. You're supposed to wake up and see them. And women that live in denial and only care about the Louis Vuitton bag are really hurting themselves, because marital assets are divided as of the date the divorce starts. So if the money is gone and the debts are there, you're responsible. And it's a very important message for women to be more proactive about their money. In marriage in this country and many others, women are conditioned to be a little bit more in a subservient role when it comes to money decisions. And that is not good. And I see the worst case scenarios. I see them every day. And sometimes with very good spouses that are not necessarily divorce planning, but are really just bad at money. And they're not good at saving money. And the wife is just concerned that the credit card bill minimums are being paid, and not realizing that there's going to be a cliff that they're going to fall off. And it's going to potentially lead to divorce, when maybe she was in a position to stop that cliff from happening, because let's assume she loves her husband and doesn't want to end the marriage. But those women that are in the dark willfully, being a little naive or in denial, they're the ones that are going to blame their spouse and blame everyone else except themselves. Because I have seen marriages be saved and financial situations reverse themselves when the wife knows, maybe I need to get a part-time job. Maybe I need to do a little bit less takeout. Maybe our child needs to go to a state school and not a private college, because we simply cannot afford it. And so these are important conversations to have that can actively prevent a divorce if they're caught early and parties are a little bit more transparent. Also be transparent with your teenagers, with your children. The money could run out, and what's going to happen to our marriage when that happens. So one of the most important things, not necessarily divorce related, it's just smart financial planning, and definitely correlates to estate planning at some point.
Well, and the judge, again, is not going to allow you to, is not going to just say you were the victim in this, you didn't know. They're going to require that you had active participation. So they're going to say you actively ignored it, or you actively avoided the conversation. And not always does everybody have, these conversations about finances, but then those relationships have figured out a way to balance it in a way that makes sense. For other people, or having the conversation even about your kids, a lot of times when they're going through divorces, they're like, well, how am I going to tell the kids that they need to start paying for their own things? How am I going to tell them they can't go to private school, or they can't continue in hockey and things like that? And again, it's because people can't, like, we're on a Mediator podcast. We're talking about communication. Mediation is all about communication and facilitating that communication with couples that have not been having these discussions, and the judge, though, is sitting back and being like, well, you should have. Like, I don't care if you didn't. Like, that's not normal. You should have had conversations about that. And the judge is not going to just sit back and be like, oh, poor you. And I think whether or not it's the man or male or the female, or whether it's a same sex, it does not matter. They're not going to let anybody off the hook, because guess what? The judge is going to look and say, oh, so you just got to spend whatever you want for 5, 10, 15 years, which most people don't get to do. And now you want to play victim. Again, it could be that you really were the victim, but the judge is not going to have that perspective. And perspective is everything in divorce.
Yeah. Divorce is really when everyone is held accountable. And we are shifting in New York and in many other states away from the lifestyle that you're accustomed to. That's a sort of an antiquated concept. Now it's reasonable needs. What are your reasonable needs? And it is living in denial. It is a little bit of wishful thinking. In my experience, the women, and it's mostly women that had those pampered lifestyles, are the ones that have the most expensive divorce cases, because they are very gullible. They're going to listen to the attorney that says, I'm going to get you what you want at trial. By the time that happens, they're $50,000 to $100,000 in on legal fees. And then they're dealing with a harsh reality that they really chose that lawyer to keep them in denial for an extra year or two. And it really is a harsh outcome for a lot of these women. And it is mostly women, unfortunately. I think the culture of divorce is set up that way. Mediation, it can be awkward. And I tell clients often, we do conferences sometimes with 2 attorneys and 2 clients, and sometimes with a mediator. It can be intensely awkward to sit in a conference room and be confronted with the reality. And you're sitting there against your spouse, and you have to acknowledge the truth here. It's a lot more comfortable sometimes for parties to avoid that mediation and just go back and forth with emails for a year with their lawyers, with financial statements, with positions that are completely opposite to one another, when they don't have to confront the reality. Mediation is all about uncomfortable conversations sometimes. And it's done in an atmosphere that's safe, where you can be heard, where your facts are going to be put forth. But in the end, it comes down to what assets exist at the time the case starts. Those are mostly going to be divided 50-50 with very rare exceptions. And what is the income that now has to support 2 households and the needs of children who are getting older. Teenagers are not a joke. If they have activities and expenses, those are going to be prioritized in most cases. And it's hard to accept. So going back to what we first started, if you can figure out those numbers and understand the financial reality before you even go to the mediator or the lawyer, really understand what happened to the money, because hopefully you will have been paying attention for a few years before you get to the scenario where your marriage is ending. You're going to be much more realistic. You're going to be much more willing to hold yourself accountable if you're the one who spent the money, and not live in denial. And that's the whole point. You need to be understanding all of the money all the way along, and not be in a position where you're the innocent party and let me blame my husband, because that's not the way it plays out mostly in court.
Right. And I think if we even everything that you're saying is resonating so well. Like, I think this is brilliant. I think that when we're talking about going back a little bit to the past. So when you got married, it was a legal agreement that you joined forces, kind of like a business, I think. Anyway, and the problem is you just went into it blind because you were so in love, and you didn't consider that maybe you wanted to put some agreements in place, because for a long time those agreements were really bad, and they would basically predict that you would get divorced, or they would have some connotation about them. But I think marital agreements and these concepts should really be discussed. And what we traditionally knew as a prenup or a postnup, but for this purpose, we're talking about a prenup, and it's a marital agreement. You know, how can a prenup or this prenuptial agreement act as insurance in a marriage? Or really, per what you just said, how do you have some of those uncomfortable conversations maybe before you get married, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would want to know if I got married today, what debts my potential partner has. I would want to look at their tax return and see what the income really is. And of course, assets. It's always exciting if your spouse has a lot of assets, but it's important to know those don't belong to you. And I love the term insurance. As a matter of fact, I just trademarked the term. Prenuptial agreements are divorce insurance, because that's really how I regard them. It's prenuptial agreements today serve as a form of financial planning. It's a safety net so that you're not hit with the worst case scenario in the event of a divorce. And putting on my litigation hat for a moment and thinking of worst case scenarios, without a prenuptial agreement, everything can be fought. You can go after your spouse's inheritance, or at least ask questions about it. You can challenge whether it's marital property and whether there's been funds commingled. You can request spousal support, even in a 6-month marriage, or ask for, marital property in ways that are unreasonable. Ask for 75% of marital property. A prenuptial agreement acts as a hedge against all of that. Not only does it provide at least a communication tool, because you have to share information and talk about it, which is always good. And it doesn't have that stigma of I'm being a gold digger just to find out what my spouse has. But although you can't address child support or child custody, you can address, am I going to be able to ask for spousal support? And should we be married at least 5 years before I can ask for spousal support? Or can we agree at least I will have left the workplace before I ask for spousal support? You can agree, like I said before, that any house we buy is going to be in joint names. And if you contributed some of your premarital IRA towards the purchase price of the house, yes, of course, you should get that money back. I mean, prenups are just fair. They're fair because people love each other when they're signing them. At the very least, they want to be fair. And so you end up with written agreements that have reasonable terms and provide that safety net. Sometimes prenuptial agreements don't cover all of these bases, but usually they cover these, and also you can disinherit your spouse. So if you're in a very short marriage before you have children, your spouse is not going to be entitled to your estate, which in New York law is 1/3 of the estate. So that could be a really big windfall if it's a very short marriage with no children. So it just feels good to put that in writing. It is a communication tool, and prenuptial agreements keep people out of court. They don't make crazy claims that they're motivated to make when they're angry and upset and there's no prenup. So, and prenups don't cost that much. They're very inexpensive considering how much protection they provide. And we can't ignore that the divorce rate is still between 30 and 40%. As I said before, younger people have a lower divorce rate. The divorce rate used to be as high as 60%. It's now fallen to below 50%. And people that marry with a college degree and in their late 20s, their divorce rate is only 30 to 40%, which is still quite high. So, there's very little reason not to do a prenup, in my view.
Well, and the interesting thing is you brought up all of these issues that have to do with the house or with future income, our current assets, current debts, all of these financial issues that, again, the courts are not really able to handle, which is why they hire experts. But also, when you're in that situation that you don't know your financial picture, but it appears that it's a good financial picture for your spouse, you could hire an attorney that's just there fighting all these issues. So they're going to fight about the kids. They're going to fight about splitting the art collection. They're going to fight about the silverware. Like, and you're going to pay $300 to $500 an hour for them to have these discussions, conversations, to fight the fight. And they're going to fight that fight for you because they make money uncovering all rocks and turning over all stones. But the reality is, it's only because you may not have discussed, like, simple discussions around these
Right.
complex matters and stating your wants and desires. Like, that's another piece of really enunciating, what do you want out of this process? Because a mediator's not going to know that you
Right.
prefer the cat over the dog. Like, you're going to have to start to have a voice in this process. And typically you haven't had a voice if you don't have any financial control.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, prenuptial agreements, I should mention, they're absolutely mandatory if you have a business or if you own a piece of real estate before the marriage. It would be malpractice for a lawyer not to recommend it, or even an accountant. It can get so messy. If you even are a 5% shareholder in a business or you own a co-op that has a small mortgage, you are asking for trouble not to have a basic prenup just to address those issues. Because otherwise, you could have extensive litigation. Courts are required to value businesses if any growth occurred during the marriage. So you're going to have a ton of legal fees for very little reason. I have a case right now. I have a young client who's a chiropractor, was married less than 6 months without a prenup, and has been in court for 2 years already because the wife simply will not let go. The wedding was huge. They're still paying bills on the wedding. They're already separated, and they're having one of the biggest contested cases we have because he owns a business. People also do prenups for IVF, for frozen embryos. Very important to do. And this is becoming a bigger issue now with people getting married at later ages. And so there's almost no good reason not to do a prenup unless you're truly, broke with hourly wages and starting from nothing. Even then, you want to watch out for student debts. You don't want to be responsible for your spouse's debts. That should be addressed in a prenup. And you want to know if there's child support obligations. There can be some very unpleasant surprises that come up after marriage. And so prenups make the disclosures mandatory, can be a little uncomfortable to talk about, but almost always leads to a healthier, more honest, and even stronger marital relationship. So as you can see, I'm a very, very, very big fan. And more, you're going to see more and more of them in your mediation cases because
Oh, yeah.
numbers are growing big time.
Well, and if you take the business valuation side just one step further, we have a situation where a lot of businesses are family held, and they could be generationally family held. A lot of farms and properties are family held and generationally family held. So we have marriages that come into this wealth or perceived wealth, and it's really not owned by them. Again, your lawyer may charge you a lot of money to go chase that money up to the family and may not prevail because they've done good estate planning to protect it, even if you didn't get a prenup to protect it. So a
Right.
prenup is also good for second marriages and things where you want to protect not only your assets, but your children's inheritances and, children from other marriages. I mean, I would say nobody should get a second marriage without a prenup, but
Yeah.
certainly.
It's actually good for the relationship between the new step parent and the children because a lot of times children are very resentful that their parent has married someone else and they're thinking, what happened to my share of inheritance? I'm sorry, that's how people think. And it can create a lot of resentment that can actually lead to the end of the second marriage. So doing a prenup, being open and honest, I own a house, it's going to my children. I just want you to know that. And it's going to be in
Mhm.
writing. And I need you to be okay with that. And if your spouse is not going to be okay with that, I mean, that's a big red flag. Maybe you want to reconsider marriage. I mean, I think a lot of people really aren't going to want to get married without a prenup because why would you when the divorce rate is between 30 and 50%? I mean, it's a really poor financial decision when you think about it.
But the reality is, a prenup could, if done well, guarantee the favorable outcome that the court is basically charging you to come up with. So the court could charge you 10, 15, 100,000. You and I see more like the 50 to 100 to 200,000, right?
Mhm.
Of this fees to your attorneys to get this done. So it really is that you can create at the beginning, maybe not exactly how it works, but an agreement of, you know what, we're going to marry because we love each other, but we're going to love each other enough to separate in a reasonable fashion. And I think that does create the insurance or the peace of mind in that process. And why would like, we almost just have to change the narrative about that it be a bad thing. That's why I'm like, it's a business agreement. You're agreeing to this partnership, and like how you want to, and gosh forbid you say, well, let's agree to this partnership and we want to go to the blue land and they want to go to the red land. And you're like, wait, we're not even close to it, right? That is good insurance for this process.
Absolutely. I think I love the fact that it's being destigmatized. And believe me, the people that want prenups the most are women breadwinners. I mean, that's a fact. The ones that are coming into a marriage with money or they own their home, women do not like to pay spousal support. That's just a fact. They don't necessarily want to put their assets at risk. Women are more financially conservative when it comes to their own assets. And so women are jumping up to sign up for these prenups as well. They're suggesting them, they're asking for them. And I think that's a great sign. I love to see women being smart about their money.
Yeah, and even just to be like, it's a marital agreement, because you did mention one thing during, and I don't know a lot about legal separations. And again, divorce is state specific, so understand that. But you said some interesting things earlier that I want to just kind of address, because I deal, of course, with a lot of family held businesses within a divorce. And always there's a lot of benefits from being in that business, either via paying for your health insurance or your cell phone or anything like that. And you talked, and sometimes, maybe we just need to get through the next 3 years of the kids being in school and whatever the financial situation is. Maybe we don't have enough to do everything. This legal separation is interesting because it doesn't really, my issue isn't around do we have enough money to split. My issue is around we need to keep a house because we have a low interest rate. We need to keep insurance in place because I have a medical issue. And if I get kicked off, it's going to cost all of us more money, right? We need to make
Right.
this money work better
Yep.
for us until we can get to a better space. So what is this legal separation, and how's it different from like an actual divorce, and how could it be used in some of these situations? You touched on it a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. So you could have a case where your daughter's getting married next year, or your child is in drug rehab. Now is not the time for us to even mention the word divorce. But let's do a legal separation where we agree from this point forward, whatever new money you get, income, debts, those are yours. Whatever I have on my side is mine. We agree on how we're going to divide up retirement and the house and other assets. Most people have similar assets. We put it all in writing now, which gives you tremendous peace of mind, because a lot of times you just want it in writing that we've agreed on all of these things. And someone who's contributing to their retirement, they want to know that all their new contributions belong to them, so they don't feel financially exposed. You want to know that everything's in writing and you could start to go out and date if that's what you want to do. Or that your future, you're starting to take steps to maybe look for a new place to live. So a legal separation agreement is the same exact thing as a divorce agreement. Everything is put in writing regarding custody, child support, spousal support, how you divide up assets and debts, but you're not yet moving forward yet with the court process. So maybe you delay that for a year or two because it can be financially advantageous. And it's about timing. I mean, you know what's going on with your children. If you have a child who's a senior in high school, you know you're not selling the house until graduation. So the legal separation will put all of that in writing, when the house will be listed for sale. And I have seen people do them 2 or 3 years before they know they're going to actually separate. It brings tremendous peace of mind. and you feel like you're at least moving forward with your future in some tangible way. And I have seen people really function amicably with a legal separation agreement. And it's such a big relief for them that at least they're transitioning towards the end of their marriage. And I have seen couples do legal separation agreements and stay with it for 5 or 10 years because it's exactly what they needed to at least financially separate, because that's really what it is. It's a custody agreement and a financial separation. Do they need to actually get divorced? Some people will say, I'm fine with legal separation. It's sometimes a religious marriage or a couple that's a little bit older that still wants to go to church together or still wants to go on vacation together, but they also want to be separated. It can work really, really well. And believe it or not, I have couples that I do divorces sometimes for people well into their 70s and even 80s. They want their divorce decree. I had a woman tell me, I don't want to die still being married to this man. I need to be divorced. So it's very much an emotional decision. It's a feeling of closure. It's a feeling of being safe. And you can be married to a partner that takes a lot of risks financially, is running up debts, and you just can't be part of that. You want to feel safe. And a lot of times you can do that with a written agreement.
Well, and I think that also you could have inheritances, you could have various other issues to deal with. You know, it kind of pushes the ball. The other thing is, I know a lot of couples that eventually get divorced spend several years living somewhat separate lives. And so, I like literally, they could be in a full household with children or without, or grown children, not be sharing bedrooms, not be getting along bad or good. It's just sort of become more roommates, friends, things like that. And they may want to find another romantic relationship, but like financially, let's just kind of keep it alike. So that is a great option for legal separation if that's and figure out in your state what that actually means and talk it through, or even talk it through with your spouse in general, the idea of some of these factors, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it used to be that there was a waiting period in New York, and in some other states there still is. You have to do a separation and wait before you file a divorce. In New York, people jump right into the no fault divorce. And I do tell them sometimes, do you want to just slow it down a little bit? Why don't you consider other options? Like I said before, there are people that are very ambivalent. They're not sure whether they actually want to start the word divorce. And sometimes you have children, the word divorce can be very, very destabilizing for the whole family. So I often tell people, no matter what your goals are, why don't you start out by saying, do you want to separate? Do you want to live apart for a little while? What would that look like? How is that going to affect our children? And how does this benefit us? And if people can be on the same page about that, the word divorce, which can feel very painful for some people, they're just not even ready to accept it. They might be able to accept a legal separation, which is a huge step towards a divorce, because basically you've already done all the work. You've divided everything, you've agreed on everything. It doesn't take a lot to do that last step. And by the time you divide up assets and debts and are living apart with a custody schedule, people sometimes say, you know what, I guess I am ready to get divorced. Can we start that process, which in New York could take up to a year. So, it is feeling emotionally ready for each stage. And the bulk of it for most families is financial planning. Like, what can we afford to do? And how can we do it without going to a judge, which is a big trend right now.
Oh, absolutely. And I think even being able to, a lot of people when they talk to their spouse about maybe wanting to, separate, they usually say, can we take a break? Can we pause this for a while? The reality is that, like, being in this space for over 20 years, I know you have very significant experience as well. The reality is we as individuals are broken and we don't work on healing ourselves. And so you have two unhealed humans that aren't even thinking about healing coming together, and it doesn't always work well. So this, can we separate? Could we work on ourselves? Could we take some time? Sometimes that actually could allow the marriage to work in a different way going forward that could be beneficial to the couple. But I like how you framed it, which is, you know, can we separate? Can we do things different? You know, like, this isn't working for me kind of situation. Is it working for you? You know, like, how do we have honest discussions about the fact that we're both living in misery, right? And hey, I don't know if we can afford this. Okay. Well, mediation is going to be an area that's you're going to be able to talk more of that. But let's stay on this topic just one more thing, because I like the concept of a postnup. And I feel like it's sort of legal separation taken one step further and putting in a written agreement. And I want to give you a scenario. We have some couples now that are kind of on the fence, and they say, well, I don't like how it's been in the past. You've kept all the finances from me. You've controlled everything. I don't want to live like this anymore, but I still love you. And I still might want to live with you and continue on if you will give me some more independence, give me some more knowledge, you know, like, walk me through some of this financials. And we've started to maybe encourage a postnup at that time period of valuing all the properties, looking at all the assets, and putting it as a time state damp or time stamp date, where you're saying, right now we're going to say this is how we split things up in a postnup, and then we're going to move forward and figure out if we can stay together. So it kind of now goes into like, well, what the heck was a post-nuptial agreement, and what's a postnup, and when should couples decide to explore this option from your perspective?
Yeah. I mean, postnups are like one step before a separation. So postnup, you still intend to stay married. But there's an issue that has given reason to put some financial terms in writing. So we did a lot of postnups during the pandemic because parties were living apart. And there were things going on where there were reasons why people needed to live in different states. Maybe the husband had to go relocate, or children were in a certain school district, or went to go live with family. Remember, everyone was wearing masks and afraid to be in certain situations for health reasons. And so postnuptial agreements are very good at addressing problems that have come up or expenses that need to be paid, but you're not sure you want to still divide up assets. Usually assets, real estate assets, are divided as of the date you actually decide to end the marriage, because we all know real estate values fluctuate. But sometimes I've had cases, for example, with gambling debts or paying for the wedding of a daughter from a first marriage, that can be really big reasons to fight. And the parties had never discussed how to address those issues before. In a postnup, you can be creative. So I had a case, just going back to the gambling debts, where the couple wanted to stay married. The husband had huge online gambling debts, which are a very big issue these days. People are gaming and doing things with gambling online. The wife found out about it. And so how they dealt with it is, in the postnup, they agreed that he would be solely responsible for those debts, and she would no longer be required, because she was a teacher, to share her retirement assets with him as of a certain date. And so they put all of that in writing. He went to counseling. So they've effectively resolved her retirement assets and the gambling debts and kind of addressed those separately. And to this day, they're still a married couple. They reconciled. And in her mind, she has something fair because she's not responsible for his gambling debts. And so if he falls off the wagon and gambles again, she's protected. So postnups are a way to deal with very creatively these types of issues, because people that do postnups usually have been married for a while. And so it's not the same set of issues as with a prenup. In a prenup, you're naive, you don't know that much about the other person. You really haven't really developed those types of issues. And so you're really thinking what might happen. In a postnup, already you're dealing with a situation that's occurred, and you have to find a way to manage it and stay married and build up that trust. So postnups are great. I'm all about saving marriages if I can. It goes back to my own, values and really why I became a family law attorney. I don't think divorce should be the first and best option in every case.
Well, and postnups addressed an issue that people have all the time, which is fear of the unknown. So you sit in here in this limbo of, do I get divorced or not? And you're like, well, if I get divorced, can I live? Am I going to have any money? and you constantly go through that anxiety. So a Postnup can kind of address that. From a business valuation standpoint, the reason why I like Postnups is because in the divorce process, let's say you have a 2-year process, which would be a normal time frame for the types of divorces that I work with. And you have a business valuation, and we start today, and it's 6 months in. So we'll be like, okay, let's look at it as 6 months ago, like at the year end, right? What's the value? So now for the next 2 years, I'm going to value that company 4 more times at each 6 month, or when they get close to settling, or we get a court date, or they move the court date for the first time, second time, or third time. So now, even if it just costs $5,000 to value a business, I'm going to do that 4 times, 6 times. So now you're $20,000 or $30,000 in for just me, not an attorney, not 2 attorneys, not the expert they're going to hire to fight me, not the 3rd expert they might need because we are too far apart. Like all of these things could be settled in a postnup because you determine we're splitting at this time, or if an inheritance comes in as well, the person could have, like with a legal separation or a postnup, you could access that funds. You could utilize that even for the benefit of the family, but to still have that, I purchased a lake house with that inheritance. It is still mine, but it benefits us during this process. Like it can be mutually beneficial, and it should be. Ideally, they should be.
I agree.
Yeah, mutually beneficial as possible.
I mean, anytime you're talking about a business or an inheritance or even a trust, you need to have a conversation, and everything should be in writing. Everything should be in writing if those situations come up, because they can cause a lot of mess if they're not addressed and you're not on the same page. So yes, I think that's a very good example with a business for sure.
Yeah. Now, one thing that most of the people that are watching this have some experience with mediation and things, but in situations where you have really, really significant financial assets, I'm just telling you, the judge and the lawyers do not understand what I'm saying, even when I dumb it down to a 5th grade level. And, of course, there are brilliant attorneys and judges out there, but it's taken them like 20 years of hearing this stuff over and over and over again. And then they still are like, Melissa, confidentially, I really have no clue. Right. And so, in mediation, tell us a little, like, it's not like you have control, but if you have a complex situation, you shouldn't think that the judge in the court's going to be able to solve it. You should think that you first, and secondarily with your spouse, for the benefit of your family, have the solutions in your head. You need somebody to help you get them out, right? So when is mediation a better option than litigation in some of the people that you've seen?
Yeah. I personally believe, after doing this almost 30 years, that litigation should be avoided whenever possible. There's almost no good reason to just jump into a court process. Like I said, it should always be a plan B. Litigation is for scenarios where one party is already hiding assets, or is not disclosing, or is refusing to cooperate with mediation. So if that's happening, you need to consider a court strategy. Obviously, if there's any issues with actual domestic violence, abuse of a child, foreclosure of a home, there are certain emergencies. We all know them when we see them. If you're not dealing with someone reasonable, someone who is, definitely not going to cooperate with the process, not share documents, not pay bills that need to be paid, mediation can be a waste of time. It could actually be a stall tactic. It can actually harm people. So as an attorney, you need to know when a mediation is realistic, should be attempted, and when it's a waste of time and you need to go to a judge, usually as an emergency. Mediation, when both parties have access to information, let's say there's a business accountant or joint tax returns, and some transparency about the assets and debts, the incomes, the expenses, mediation should be the chosen strategy. Let's sit down, review these documents, agree what the facts are, agree on what the numbers are, and then if you have attorneys that know the law and know what a judge is going to do, then get advice from those attorneys. And at that stage, there should be a range of what support numbers will look like, a range of what might happen in terms of percentage shares of a business. Most other issues are very straightforward because you're talking about 50-50 scenarios. With businesses, it's not 50-50. With spousal support, you could have a little bit of a difference in terms of what everyone thinks should happen. But when there's trust in the process, there are ways for mediators or attorneys to try to find that middle path and agree. And when parties trust their advisors, when they have the numbers in front of them and agree that the numbers are accurate, when they're working with appraisers and experts that provide neutral information, neutral numbers, there would be no reason to go to a judge. Mediation can take a long time. I've been involved in mediations that last for more than a year, but everyone is comfortable with that. Everyone feels like they trust the numbers, and then eventually you get to the finish line. Going to a court and going to a judge, you are looking at between 1 and 3 years of very costly and stressful procedures in court, and procedures that are very adversarial. So subpoenas, depositions, potentially hearings, really extreme positions. And I have to be very clear here, people lie. When there's litigation and the stakes are very high, people are not truthful. You have a lot of he said, she said scenarios and very unreasonable positions. And the whole point is a game of chicken where everyone's somewhat bluffing to try to get their best outcome and really stacking the deck to create, really high stakes litigation. So everyone's asking for custody. Everyone wants sole custody. Everyone wants to pay either the least amount in support or they're demanding the highest number in support. And assets get hidden, and people are very motivated to hide assets. It could be LLCs, it could be offshore accounts, it could be Bitcoin, it could be assets hidden with family members or new paramours. And the worst part of litigation, the very worst part, is not only are you paying so much to lawyers, but there's going to be a trial 3 years from now. It's going to cost a fortune. And guess what? The losing party is going to appeal. So add another 2 or 3 years. I mean, you're talking could be 5 to 10 years of being in a court process. And we all know of cases where people are trying to get divorced after 10 years because those cases fall through the rabbit hole. There are different judges involved, different motions, different appellate division or appeals. These are really awful. People get sick over it. They get obsessed with their cases. They can't end these cases. And everyone runs out of money for lawyers. So I sometimes use those examples because I'm familiar with several of them that have happened in my career where there are cases that are still not ending. So that could happen to anyone.
I have the benefit, or I don't know if it's a benefit, but I work with the majority of my cases will proceed through to get to litigation. And we know the percentage of cases that go to actual litigation is like 5% or some ridiculously low number. So I have the benefit of working with the 5%. And typically the profile will be a family held business or a crazy business that was started during the marriage and just went wildfire. Usually that spouse is a little bit of a risk taker and they will bet it all and double down and then they make it big, right? So they might have a little bit of narcissism, but not diagnosed, but that's what it takes to kind of make it big and test it all. So it makes sense. But then they come into this situation where somebody's getting divorced and they don't want to do it because it's going to expose some of the lies and it's going to expose some of the fast moves that had to be made to make that wealth. But the reality is mediation is usually required in some capacity in most states if there's kids involved. So it at least allows you to get to a mediator for 2 hours, And then what you should consider doing when you're there is using mediation in tandem with a litigation strategy. So you never stop the litigation strategy, pedal to the metal if you have like a narcissistic business owner, but you run a tandem mediation strategy. And what you're doing is you're trying to gather information because they lie and
Right.
they keep things from you. So if you can get into mediation and get some of the lies exposed,
Right.
or you get the person to act up in front of their own lawyer, you get the
Right.
person to show some of their cards or do
Sure.
something, and you get some benefit out of mediation. So there's
Oh, yeah.
lots of ways to use mediation in a non-traditional way. And your first way is because you might have to go there for the kids anyway. So if you
Yeah.
can get that hook in there, maybe you can show your spouse, hey, we have a little bit of control in here. What does a narcissistic person want? Control. Put
Yeah.
them in that, so a lot of it is educating yourself on how to put your own best interests forward in some capacity, right?
I totally agree. Yeah, mediation can be very useful. You just have to consider, are you at risk if you haven't filed the case? How does that impact you if you're the moneyed spouse or the non-moneyed spouse? As long as you have a legal strategy related to when you file the case, mediation can do no harm. At the very least, it should be attempted. And I have attempted in cases where everyone predicted it wouldn't work, and then it does work. So things can happen. You can have breakthroughs in mediation, and even narcissists sometimes will agree and go along with something reasonable. So it should, in my view, should almost always be attempted. Shouldn't turn down an opportunity to settle a case.
Right. And I think if you're looking at even before you file for divorce, you have to understand that if that is a person, a profile that's in the marriage, that character, right, that you might have to go through litigation. So, either way, we like to say you have to choose what's best for you, but in some cases, somebody could say, "Oh, you could do all this through mediation." Sometimes I've seen we've tried that path, and the narcissist keeps it going now for 4 years. So you have to see when something is being used against you as a manipulation tactic. But at the very beginning, how you endeavor to do this, the attorneys that you hire could also be very instigative. Like you've talked about some of people and specific case studies where couples have gone through this legal separation or a postnup or divorce mediation. Can you give us some examples? Because again, who you hire at the beginning, if you have no clue of what's going to happen and you're just like, oh, I hired a bulldog. Oh, I hired a shark.
Yeah.
I hired we have all these terms that may or may not be your best first step.
Yeah. So specific case studies. I mean, it's a matter of how I practice law. Is I almost always look for opportunities to sit down and have a discussion and resolve issues. So I will often do just short-term custody issues, have a discussion about it, reach an agreement on it, and then we'll put it in writing. It's more of a litigation strategy to say I won't agree to do anything unless we globally resolve everything. And that creates problems because sometimes people just want to separate. So I call it a move out agreement. We'll do short term agreements just to separate the parties for a few months. It's without prejudice, which means it's not binding. You can't consider it an abandonment of the home or a long term custody issue. But I encourage any type of written agreement where people can agree on anything. Maybe it's an agreement to file taxes together or an agreement how certain bills will be paid. Whatever it takes to reach agreements, even if they're partial, I'm in favor of. And I think it builds trust for parties to see that attorneys and mediators can work together, that we don't have to leave everything open and have a global resolution of everything, which sometimes it can take many months to get to that point where everything is resolved. And I come across attorneys every day who say, Jackie, I won't do a custody agreement. We have to resolve everything. And meanwhile, you have clients that are completely freaking out. They just want to live apart and they need a custody agreement to do that. So it really is how I practice law, is to really address whatever issues I can by mediation and avoid a court process. And I've had cases that are very challenging where the attorneys work together well and the parties see that these attorneys are helping us. We've resolved custody and now we're going to resolve the financial issues. So I just encourage, that's what works for my practice, is encouraging written agreements whenever possible and only going to court if we're required to because a motion has already been filed or because there's a true emergency going on. And I'm not going to hesitate to go seek court intervention in that case. When we have orders of protection, which are very common in New York, probably a third of our cases have some sort of protective order, we can sometimes convert those into custody agreements. And we do it by saying the wife will agree to drop the order of protection as long as she stays in the home, the husband stays out for, let's say, 6 months, and we work out a custody schedule. And therefore, this order of protection, which sounds so negative, and the husband doesn't like having to deal with an order of protection. He doesn't agree with the allegations. He thinks they're all lies. But we can convert that into a short-term custody schedule because really these parties need to separate. And I'll tell my clients, I represent a lot of men, and say, listen, whether she's saying what she's saying, if it's true or false, the fact is you need to live apart. You cannot live together. So let's find an agreement where we can make that a reality. You have joint custody of your children, and we address financial issues, and we get rid of the order of protection. So again, there's so many possibilities if you're willing to be creative and just reach agreements, if you're open to that.
Well, and I think that one just personal question as we put some information about you and we're going to talk about you, is that do you think it's a red flag if when you're trying to negotiate with another party that they won't agree to anything but a global strategy?
I mean, is it a red flag? A lot of times it's a negotiating technique. We all know litigators that they practice that way, where everything is going to be high stakes, or they won't even return your calls or respond to your emails, which means you have to go to court because things are escalating. A lot of times it's a strategy. I actually just settled a case recently where the wife's attorney insisted on a global resolution or nothing. And the terms were so unreasonable. I basically told him, listen, if that's what you're going to say, let's wait until the judge gives us a trial date. I'm ready to resolve what we can. And in the end, we ended up resolving custody issues because I just wouldn't go along with that strategy. A lot of times it's just a ploy. It's just a ploy. You got to be adept and try different things. And after a while, you know all the lawyers that practice in your area, and you got to really know how to deal with them. And sometimes that means being willing to play the judge card if you have to.
Well, absolutely. And people need to know that court litigation is a tool. Mediation is a tool. The more you're aware of, what you need to do to protect yourself or what the regulations are in your state, the better you'll be prepared. But tell us more about your firm, because you're not a traditional law firm. Like you're kind of part of the good people that are, trying to change things, right?
Thank you. I like to think we do things a little bit differently. I've been with the same law firm since I was a law student. So it's been a 30-year run. And I went from law student to managing partner. So I manage the firm, I own the firm, and I have a fantastic team here. I don't want to say we're one of the good guys. This is a difficult business with a lot of difficult people, but we try to encourage clients to take the high road. And we have fewer litigation cases, because we are a high volume firm and we operate on referral, and referrals come from clients that are happy with the process, happy with the advice they got, and know that you didn't take them from a ride and charge them just to litigate for no reason. We encourage settlements. We encourage them early in the process, and that's where our referrals come from. We also do plenty of trials because, like I said, we have a large team here. So we have a lot of cases, unfortunately, that go to hearings. Actual trials, that 5%, we only do a few a year. We try to settle cases before then, but if we need to, we'll do it if necessary. I love what I do. I think you can tell. I bring a lot of psychology into my work. I have a degree in psychology as well, and I'm all about giving the best advice possible for that individual client who needs guidance that's based on what's in their best interests. And so I try to take an approach that is unique for them and their family. I think there's a lot of good actors in the space. I think I would consider you to be one of them as well. Anyone who's doing mediation is trying to do the right thing for people and keep them away from a battlefield they don't need to be on.
Absolutely. I think if you talk to people in divorce and they are helping you with strategies to settle or lower the cost or be more efficient or get it done, are going to be more helpful than I'm going to fight till the death for, But yeah. I think that we've sort of allowed this podcast to go on far longer than we normally would. So we're probably going to have 2 parts for this, but I couldn't stop. It was so good. I so much appreciate you, Jackie. And
My pleasure.
I will tell you right now, we are going to dissect the heck out of all of these topics on future podcasts with you. So I hope you're prepared because it was just so good. So
I
thank
can't believe
you.
It's been over an hour, but I enjoyed our conversation and I look forward to collaborating any way that we can. Thank you so, so much.
Oh, this has been amazing. Thank you. We'll see you soon.
See you soon. Thank you.